Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, so we are really lucky today to be joined by Dan McCrum. Dan is going to take us through the story of Wirecard, and before we do that, I'm going to give a little bit of a background, a little bit more details on Dan. But before I do that, I have to give a quick shout out to Sam at Morgan's Financial Limited from Australia. Sam was actually the one, Dan, that actually connected us, and actually suggested that I reach out to you for a chat. So well worth it. Subsequent to that, I read your book. So Sam, great idea for putting this together, and thanks for the connection. So here's a little bit of a background on Dan. He's got certainly an interesting background. He's a graduate of Durham University, where he majored in economics and politics. Interesting background, which would eventually lead to finance. But after his BA in 2001, he spent 4 years in Citigroup's equity research department. He is currently part of the investigations team at the Financial Times and has been at the Financial Times since 2007. So he's been there for quite a long period of time. And he is the journalist behind the original story, The House of Wirecard. And once the dust's cleared, he wrote a terrific book on the entire story of Wirecard entitled Money Men, a hot startup, a billion-dollar fraud, and a fight for the truth. Now, again, I've read the book. I would highly recommend you take a read of the book, whether you're a finance person, whether you're an investor, whether you have an interest in the stock market, whether you have an interest in large companies. Even if you don't have an interest in finance, if you're interested in a great rise and fall story, you would certainly be interested in the story of Wirecard. And I just want to give a little bit of background because when Sam had actually reached out, Dan, I actually didn't know who you were. And I didn't actually know the story of Wirecard all that well. I knew it to be a company that didn't end very well. But again, I didn't actually know the story of Wirecard. And, I had mentioned to one of my colleagues here in North America who was very familiar with the Wirecard story. And I said to him, I said, look, I'm going to be having a chat with Dan McCrum to talk about Wirecard. And his response to me was pretty unique. He said, you're really lucky to be able to have a chat with Dan. And then he made the comment, he said, Dan is a very brave man. And that is word for word from the email. And I thought to myself, again, this is Dan, before I even got into the book, I said to myself, man, the term brave is a very interesting description of an investigative reporter. And again, this isn't an investigative reporter, looking into the CIA or the Secret Service. This is an investigative reporter who digs into companies. And I thought to myself, man, that's an interesting description for an investigative reporter focusing on finance, that Dan is a very brave man. Then what I did is actually read the book. And then it all made sense to me. And Dan, as I'd mentioned, I was actually quite shocked at some of the stuff that I read in the book. There's no shortage of rise and fall stories in corporate finance. But then, this concept of a role of an investigative reporter certainly took on an entire different meaning for me. And, again, I certainly agree with the comment that Dan is an incredibly brave man. There's parts in his book where he talks about, Russian poison recipes, literally, in his book. And that's probably all you need to know about the risk that Dan was taking, not just for him, but for him and his family, about digging into this company, is that the role of investigative reporter is in some cases, again, quite a risky endeavor. And the lengths at what some of these companies will go through in order to try and shut individuals like yourself down, Dan, when you're trying to dig into a story, again, is stunning. And again, when I read your book, again, there's no shortage of rise and fall companies that are out there. We have a number of them over here at North America and within North America. But what I've never read before is the lengths at what some of these companies would do in order to shut you down. Again, we've interviewed, folks who have kind of blew the whistle on Enron, and the stuff in that book it doesn't compare to what, to the espionage and some of the things that you were dealing with. So when they said Dan is a brave man, it all makes perfect sense. But again, you have to read the book first in order to get that. So Dan, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. It's an absolute pleasure, frankly. So before we get into Wirecard, you have a very interesting background. We need to tee this up properly. You graduated in economics and politics. So maybe just give us some perspective on your background and how that eventually led you to Citigroup.
Yeah, well, that's the. And by the way, I feel like I've got quite a job to live up to that intro now. Thanks God. But,
read the book.
All
you have to do is read the book, and you're going to clearly. It all
and I
becomes
think, as
evident.
we'll get into, it's kind of one of those stories where I'm just like a reporter writing about finance, and suddenly my life gets turned upside down. And yeah, that doesn't happen very often as a journalist, and it was pretty wild. But I mean, I did the Keeping Your Options Open degree. Economics fascinating, politics fascinating. Kind of thought, that'll allow me to do something interesting, and then I just followed the money into finance for a bit.
Exactly.
It's like what was the famous line about why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. And I did that for long enough that I looked around and was like, geez, what am I doing here? And I kind of thought maybe there's more interesting things to do in life. And I'd always wanted to be a journalist. So I took that little bit of knowledge I had about money, economics, business, and managed to get a job with the Financial Times.
So what did you do at Citigroup? Like what was it was just researching companies? Is that kind of what the role was at Citi?
They called it research marketing. I mean, I was a grad, and I started on the trading floor. I mean, one of my first jobs was getting in before the traders, physically printing off packets of that day's research and putting them on their desks before everyone arrived.
Like 4 in the morning or something?
4:30. And then I sort of ended up in the team. We called it research marketing. But basically, I would talk to all the analysts, find out what research was coming, and write up whatever was the most interesting, sort of the highlights for the sales force. And then they would come in, and the idea being that they could read it straight to their clients on the phone.
I see.
And, help with the broking. And it was kind of interesting. I learned a huge amount about companies and stuff, but it was kind of the same question every single day. What is going to make this share price move? And I kind of wanted to do something a bit more interesting. But it sort of, I think it gave me this great sense of, you're looking for something you can sell, right? What is the heart of the idea? What is it that people don't know about? I mean, in this case, companies. And that was really useful. And, it was a good grounding to then go and work for the FT. And they sent me off to the States for a bit. And so that's where I met Sam and the guys at one of the Berkshire Hathaway annual meetings.
Really? Okay. So you've known Sam for a while then.
Yeah. Because, you go along to worship at the feet of Warren Buffett, who, for someone who has an awful lot of, homily phrases and, comes across as this very smart, humble chap, also has constructed a cult of personality around himself, which is, a fascinating way to run a business. I mean, that's probably a conversation for another time. But, and I discovered it turns out that it's basically an annual get-together for lots of people who I was writing about at the time, which is this strange breed of stock market investors.
And was there something at Citi which made you kind of say, look, like, I'm trying to figure out the right way to word this question, but was there something, was there kind of something that happened where you say, man, like, I can do better. I can do more writing about these companies, or I can reveal more about these companies if I'm working at the Times. It's just such a unique path to go from working at Citi as an equity researcher to kind of an investigative reporter at the Financial Times. Like that linkage, was there anything there, or it was just kind of, right place, right time? You had an interest in writing,
I
and
mean,
off you go.
a little bit of that. I mean, there's a bunch of people at the FT who have a little bit of finance experience, usually just enough to put them off.
Yeah.
Because, if you hang around in finance too long, I mean, I remember my first editor saying this in the interview, it's like a golden balloon. At what point do you jump off? And if you leave it too late, you're too high up. So I jumped early enough, and I kind of just always knew I wanted to be a journalist. It was one of those stupid conversations where everyone was saying, hey, if you could do anything, what would you do? And everyone else was like, I'd go retrain as a vet or a doctor or, and I said journalist. And my friend just looked at me like I was some sort of idiot. She was like, you can do that. And by the way, you don't go, I mean, you've used the word investigative journalist a lot, and, I'm very lucky to get to do that. But I don't think you necessarily set out to go, I'm going to be an investigative journalist. I was very much, I'm going to learn how to be a journalist. And that seemed terrifying enough. And then you sort of learn the practice of it. And investigations is just like normal journalism with the luxury of time. There are, thousands of great journalists out there who, if they didn't have constant deadlines and editors shouting at them, could be doing great investigations.
And your role as an investigative journalist, is it to focus on the companies who are potentially hiding stuff or have more to tell, as opposed to, the next up and coming, great company? Like, are you guys more focused again on the companies that have the potential downside as opposed to the ones on the upside? Or is it just, what, you guys can write about both companies, good or bad?
I mean, we write about good companies at the FT, but I was drawn to the negative stories.
I see.
It's because I was writing about, the investment industry in New York, and I just started to get interest in these weird guys, these short sellers. And I remember, Carson Block came out with this very famous report. He's the Muddy Waters short seller about Sinoforest.
Oh, we know Sinoforest
Total
in
fraud.
Toronto. Yeah.
And of course. Oh, yeah, big Canadian fraud. Yeah.
We know that one, Dan. We might not know Wirecard all that well, at least until I read your book. But most of us especially if you're in finance, is that the story of Sinoforest pretty well. Absolutely. Yes.
And because I covered John Paulson, the genius of the financial crisis, my editor shouts at me about there's this story going on with Sinoforest, and Paulson was, I think, the second biggest shareholder, and so I start flicking through this report from Carson Block with pictures of what are supposed to be the offices, and it's some very dowdy looking residential block somewhere in China, and I remember reading this, and it was like a light bulb went off, and I was like, this seems like fun. Is this the sort of thing? Isn't this what I should be doing? And I kind of just got more interested in like the short sellers and the short campaigns, Bill Ackman and Herbalife. And I kind of felt like there was this sort of journalistic niche there that not many people were looking at, and kind of just got drawn into it because it was interesting, not out of any, determination.
Yep.
And then it was like, there's a bunch of frauds out there.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can find some.
That's a tough thing to find, too. Now, you mentioned Carson Block. Maybe to talk a little bit, Dan, about how a short seller differs from an investigative reporter. Because, again, I think, your ability to invest in these companies and things like that is pretty much zero. You don't really have an ability. It's not like you're going to benefit off of the company's share price going down. Whereas in the case of some of the shorts...
Can we just be clear about that, Scott? Zero. It is zero. Not pretty much zero. It is zero.
There's no...
It's amazing how people are like, but surely you can make some money from it. I'm like, no money whatsoever.
So maybe just explain that point then. Explain the difference between the motivations of a short seller and the motivations of an investigative reporter. and how those two are different, because they're very different.
So your short seller wants the share price to go down. And if they're the activist type, they might make a lot of noise and try and bring that about quickly. And, lots of people short stocks for different reasons. But basically, they have a financial interest to move the share price south. Whereas a journalist, we care about great stories, glory. Always got to remember that's what journalists are wired a little bit differently. And what we want to do is expose stuff that gets attention and to own the story and to really, basically the thrill of having this amazing front page where you sort of say to everyone, you guys are not going to believe what we found out. And because we don't have a dog in the fight, we don't really care about what company it is or, who it is or anything like that. It's just, okay. It sounds, a lot of people go, oh, we're searching for the truth. And that's sort of kind of, yes, we are doing it. But we're trying to write stories in the public interest that, people might care about. And, it's a business, an entertainment business. We are trying to interest people in the story so they continue to subscribe to our newspaper.
So the other thing you get from your book is the process that goes that, again, you mentioned like the front page of the story, headline, story. But there's a big process that goes along. And I'm not talking about the fact-finding process. Obviously there's a lot that goes on there. I'm talking about the vetting, the lawyers involved, again, the risk of being wrong. You know what I mean? Like, again, you clearly get that to say, look, if you put something out there that's not correct, it's, again, there's consequences, even if it is just your reputation. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, because again, I think people would be keen to understand. It's not like, you just sit in your laptop in some coffee shop and put together some article that hits the front page. This is articles that gets vetted, reviewed by lawyers, reviewing words. Again, you're trying to get feedback from the company to the extent that you can. Give them some perspective on just the work involved over and above pulling together the facts on the story. There's a big review process that's involved as well.
Well, so the way we come at stories from the Financial Times, it's a pretty simple practice in that for any story, you need two sources. Now, that can be two human sources. It can be a human and documents. It can be different things. And, obviously, if the company has announced something, you can probably take that to the bank. But on anything sort of difficult, you need two sources. And then you have to give people the right to reply. We call it no surprises journalism. And when you get into sort of legally contentious stories, the ones which are damaging, that the powerful people don't like, well, when you start to get pushback, maybe letters from their lawyers, or certainly you're running the risk of a libel suit, which in the UK is a much bigger deal than it is in North America, because our courts are somewhat challenging in that respect. That's when you start to have these extra layers of, editorial review. If it's really important, it's going to go all the way up to, the big boss editor.
Yep.
You run it past the our amazing in-house lawyer, Nigel Hansen, who he's kept me out of trouble for a very long time. And yeah, it's I think it's that sort of the process itself is, I think sometimes people imagine there's more of it than it is. For some stories, it's you got a reporter, you got a couple of editors, and boom, it's out in the wild. But for those tricky ones, every single word has been thought about.
Yeah.
And you're constantly thinking about what risk are we taking here, and I won't bore you with all the details of it, but it's often like minor facts and minor people that can get you in trouble as well, or it'll be the implications of an offhand phrasing that you hadn't thought about, and the lawyer will be like, "You've realised? Can you prove that?"
So, end of the day, let's assume you have a story. It's about to go out the next day, going to hit, quote unquote, hit the presses, whatever, at the early morning. How do you sleep the night before, Dan? Are you at that point, are you sleeping like a baby and all is good? Or are you one of the folks that, it's quite stressful? kind of the night before? How do you sleep the night before a big story?
Well, my boss has this great phrase. He says, "You know, you have a big story because you hit print and then you almost throw up." And that's how you know you've got a good one, because it matters. But like with any story, you've always got that nagging doubt of like, what have we missed? What could we have got wrong? It's this sort of step into the unknown. And and you have to listen to that little nagging voice, just in case. It's the one that tells you, hang on, did you check that one detail? Go back and double check it again.
And there must be a lot of details. Like, it's not like there's one there's just so many pieces to the story. It's it's quite the process to put together these entire stories. It's not just one. This isn't like a quick exercise. This is an extensive effort to eventually, hit the newspaper. And again, you certainly got that from your book.
Yeah. Well, you said this earlier. It's I think you said like it's hard to find frauds, and like no. There's loads of frauds out there. What's really hard is proving that they're frauds, because there's a whole bunch of companies which people have suspicion about. But it's moving from that something looks a bit funny to here's a hard fact that we can say, and that's the really hard bit.
Hey, here's another question for you too, Dan. Do you think with the advent of like Twitter and all these social medias where you have, I'm sure, all of these amateur investigative reporters who in some cases are probably putting out facts, but in some cases are probably just putting out things that are not factual, and perhaps trying to just, make noise, do whatever they want to do. And I'll bet you, again, if you rolled the clock back to 2007, those people didn't exist at that point. Does that make your job easier or harder trying to compete with, again, some of these, let's say, amateur, investigative reporters who do not go through anywhere close to the same process that you would go through in terms of publishing a story?
Well, I think it helps us in the sense that you have this very degraded information environment. So people aren't following the same sources. There's all sorts of stuff happening on some of the social medias. And I think that helps us, having a big recognized brand like the FT. But also, I think I'm more competing with the likes of, the various short selling outfits which will pop up. And, I've been scooped more than once by a short seller suddenly going, here's a whole thing. And sometimes, there are some really great short sellers out there, and there are some more interesting guys.
Yeah. Well, and I can imagine, for the shorts as well, the consequences for them to being wrong aren't obviously the same as the consequences for you to be wrong, because again, you've got a whole brand effectively with the Financial Times, whereas, short seller X, Y, and Z, if they're wrong, it might not have the same level of consequence that perhaps you would have. Because that's the other thing you realize coming in the book is that the consequences of being wrong and being, let's say, factually incorrect are significant. It's there's a reason why you're about to throw up when you hit this big story. It's because it's quite stressful.
Well, maybe we should talk about Wirecard a little bit, because what happened there is, we come across this, initially funny little German company, becomes quite big, calls itself the PayPal of Europe, and it's doing something to do with, moving money around, credit card processing. And we are trying to convince the world that these guys are crooks. This is a criminal enterprise, top to bottom. And we're sort of writing these stories, picking it away at it, going, okay, we can't prove the whole thing, but we can prove there's some fraud going on over here. There are guys in the finance team faking documents. Why aren't they all fired? And so we're writing these stories and sort of trying to work out, why aren't they cutting through? Why aren't more people listening to us? And we can talk about that. But we also knew if we made any mistake, any sort of correction, that they would seize on it and completely discredit everything.
Yeah.
So it kind of feels like this high wire act. You can't make a mistake, because as soon as you make a mistake, it's all over.
Okay, so maybe Dan, the next thing to talk a little bit about is as we get into the Wirecard details, is give us some perspective on Wirecard before you kind of got into the details. What was the reputation of Wirecard sort of within the German marketplace before you kind of started to uncover some things?
So Wirecard was, I mean, maybe not a meme stock, but it was one of those cool tech companies that had a real retail investor stock market following. You know, it had an English name, Wirecard,
Yeah.
and it sounds stupid, but I've spoken to German guys who are like, yeah, no, I went to work there, and it just seemed really cool. Like it's a tech company, and a whole bunch of people have made money by owning it forever, and the share price had gone up and up and up, and it grew really quickly. And it had this kind of great message, the cashless economy. And it's kind of like our business is really complicated, but all you need to know is it's all about digital money, not notes and coins.
And this is back in 2005, right? Like this is back in I guess maybe like 2008, I guess 2009.
Yeah,
Is
2008.
That the time? Like it was a
mean,
total different time frame in terms of in this concept of digital money.
Yeah. So, okay, so the first time I hear about Wirecard, it's the summer of 2014. I'm talking to this Australian hedge fund manager who knows the kind of thing I'm interested in, John Hempton, Bronte Capital. And he says to me, hey, Dan, would you be interested in some German gangsters? And I'm like, yeah, what? What are you talking about? And he tells me about this funny company that is called Wirecard, calls itself the European PayPal. And it's worth about 4 billion euros then, probably about $4 billion. And what is weird about it is it's really hard to work out what it does. You open the annual report and you can't quite work it out. There's lots of buzzwords in there, lots of tech speak, but how it all hangs together is very hard to say. And it's just growing really quickly and is also really profitable, unusually high margins. And that is weird, right? Because it's quite hard to do that. You can do one or the other generally. And it turns out there are 2 theories about it. So one is that it's just too good to be true. They're cooking the book somehow and the profits aren't real. But the other is that it has a certain reputation in the industry. And this is where the gangsters come in, because it's kind of thought that if you have any sort of nasty business online that you want to get payments processed for, you go to Wirecard. And that explains a lot. Because you have this sort of certain level where it's this retail stock market investor favorite because they've made a bunch of money on it. And it also kind of gets this pass because it plays into that complexity. It tells people, oh, our business is really complicated. And I think there's a lot of professional investors who look at that and sort of think there's a bit of a nudge wink happening here in that its background is in processing lots of payments for gaming, gambling. And it's kind of assumed that it operates in lots of grey areas. And that's kind of profitable, right?
Yep.
And maybe that's why it doesn't want to talk too much about its business. So we'll give it a pass. And it's kind of has this reputation, but as it becomes bigger and more prominent, Germany starts to get excited because, hey guys, we've got an actual homegrown tech company here. And the thing to realize about sort of Europe, but Germany in particular, is incredible manufacturing heritage. Makes all the cars that we certainly used to care about. But Europe does not have a lot of big tech companies. The West Coast and China, they've got all of them. And so you look around Europe and you've basically got like SAP,
Yep.
which makes software for manufacturing companies. And so suddenly you have this cool new upstart with this really simple message, the cashless economy. And its share price sort of starts becoming self-fulfilling.
Yep.
Everyone's getting rich. It's doing really well. The numbers are great. And it becomes this kind of sensation. And so I start writing about it in 2014. But all I can say is, because it's very difficult to use the F word in print, fraud, obviously. Mm-hmm. And I start trying to write these stories about it being a puzzle. Do its numbers really make sense? What's going on? We seem to have found these things which don't really add up. It's buying these businesses here. And when you go and knock on the door or, you look into it, there's not very much there. But they're saying, oh, it's this great expansion into all over Asia. But it carries on, and it joins, the DAX index, which is Germany's sort of 30 or 40 biggest listed companies. And it kind of becomes the next big thing. And so we reached this point in about 2018, because I'm sort of scratching away at this company for ages. And suddenly it's worth $30 billion. And again, in US stock market terms, that's not actually that big anymore. But,
in Canadian stock market terms, though, that's you're getting pretty big at that point.
Yeah,
certainly
yeah,
in Canada, that's a pretty big company. Yeah,
it's pretty sizable. It's certainly it's big enough that it's automatically going into everyone's pension fund.
Yeah. Maybe just talk a little bit about the kind of the two executives as well that ran Wirecard. And give us just some, what were your initial sort of interactions with those two individuals, and how did those discussions go? Especially, again, as you say, scratching away, asking questions. What was your initial sort of interactions with those two, the two main executives at Wirecard?
Okay, so the two guys who run it actually turn out to be Austrian, not German, and they have this weird dynamic, the joke inside the company at one point was, they were like a married couple. Certainly I think it was more like an older brother, younger brother thing going on. So the older guy is Dr. Marcus Brown, and he's very cold, very reserved, very uptight. He basically had a special garage under the office where his chauffeur-driven car would go into. The shutter would come down, and he would take a lift straight up to, like his personal lift, straight up to the 6th floor. And he was very careful. He would never take notes in meetings. If he did, he would tear them up and throw them in the bin at the end. And he didn't really do email. He would call you into his office to have a conversation. And that was it. And and they would run the business on Telegram, the message thing. Which, if you've ever encountered like a regulated financial company environment, just as a complete aside, when we're reporting this, you learn things. Like, wait, what? And so there's this moment we're finally talking to this whistleblower, and he's like, "Oh yeah, no, we ran all the business on Telegram." And you're like, "Sorry, what are you talking about? This is basically a bank." But so you have this guy in charge, and he is cold. Very few people are close to him, and he bills himself as the founder. And he's the one who has basically run it forever, turned it from this tiny little thing into this huge global enterprise. And he's a former management consultant. I mean, you know the type, I'm sure. All blue sky thinking. Buzzwords, everything's like Apple, transition, and so I get to speak to him once in this entire episode. So early on, we've done a bunch of digging, and I've basically found there seems to be some problems because they've bought these businesses in Asia, and what they're telling people at home in Germany doesn't match what's on the ground in Asia. I'm like, huh. And so I finally get him on the phone, and, I let him talk his talk for a bit. You've got to warm people up. And so he bangs on, for like 20 minutes or so, this sort of incomprehensible thing. And, I'm sort of there going, I'm beginning to see why you don't do a lot of interviews. But like one of the great things about being a journalist is you get to ask people very rude questions. And so at a certain point, I sort of say to him, hey, what's going on? Like, we've looked into these deals you've done, something doesn't add up. Basically, are you making it up? Are you a crook? And what always sticks with me is his tone. So he does deny it. He goes, yes, that's bullshit. But it's very much in the, oh, I get asked this all the time. Yes. Let me explain why I'm absolutely not a crook and everything's fine. And that was such a weird response to me. Because normally if you say to someone, are you a crook? You get a bit angry.
Yeah.
And then he used these sort of different techniques which liars use. So, he answered with a question. Why would I do these things? Why indeed? And then he invokes outside authority. He said, I think, what did he say? You must have been talking to some people who are jealous of our success. Look at the accounting firm who we have on board. Look at all the analysts who think we're great. Look at the banks who are involved with us. They wouldn't be involved if we're a fraud. And so I was left with this very strong impression that he was lying to me. And so that is kind of him. And it raises this really and he's still on trial in Germany, by the way. So, we're slightly giving away the ending. But yes, he is ultimately exposed as, I think, a crook. But, the German trial has been going on for almost 3 years now, and I think it probably will get there at some point. But it raises that interesting question about, let's assume he's lying. What kind of person does it take to lie like that for 15 years?
Yeah.
But we should talk about the other guy as well.
Well, the other guy's, he's not currently on trial. And,
So hang on,
and that maybe tell you all you need to know. I'm not quite sure which one is more interesting, but yeah.
So if I tilt my screen around slightly, you can see his wanted poster, which I have on the wall behind me,
Nice.
which is his Interpol red notice. And so what we start to do is we start to realize that, okay, actually, you've got this chief exec who's, giving the orders, but it seems like he doesn't like to fly anywhere. He very rarely travels. Like, the rumor inside the company is he is afraid of flying. When he does do it, he flies by private jet. And he doesn't tend to go far, mainly just to Saint-Tropez. And the guy who is running around the world, fixing up all the schemes, taking care of everything, they call him their chaotic genius. It's this guy called Jan Marsalek. And he is, he's about my age. Back then, he's sort of in his mid-30s. He's super charming, could talk for hours, bit of a whiz kid. And he's the one who is running around making these little frauds happen, cleaning up the messes, coming up with the schemes. But as we're reporting on it, we start to discover that he has some unusual extracurricular interests. And so he's hanging out with Russian spies.
How did you guys find that out? Like, how did that get uncovered, Dan?
What I would actually recommend is there's literally a podcast which has just come out in the last few weeks from my colleague Sam Jones. It's our Hot Money podcast, which tells that entire story.
Okay.
And it is wild. And sort of that, and the first episode is very much that. Wait, how did you come to find this out? And so, but basically, we had weird stuff happen with the company. So there's this moment early on where my boss gets offered $10 million if he can make these nasty stories about Wirecard just go away.
That's a lot of money, too.
That was our first reaction. We're like, that's a lot of money. I have to say, I don't know how much you know about the economics of journalism, but there are surprisingly few offers of $10 million flying around. And so we get this, and initially we're like, no, really? And we're like, that's quite a lot of money. But then we kind of realised this must be a trap, because Wirecard, like right from the beginning, normal companies have public relations firms who deal with you. And Wirecard had that. But then they also they were trying to set up these back channels. And so they had somehow discovered that my boss, Paul Murphy, who's this sort of old school British hack who has long sought out interesting characters as a source of stories.
He likes the lunch. That's the one thing that I certainly learned from the book, is he loves the lunch, right?
He is master of the lunch. And he did a lot of, M&A reporting, breaking deal news, that sort of thing. And so he was sort of tapped into this network of stock market speculators, which is people like, bankers, investors, traders, and nightclub owners. Rich retired dudes who did like one private equity deal and have headed off into the sun. This whole that layer of finance just below, like the respectable surface. He was sort of tapped into that scene for like getting, and so this company, like we learned that so our first introduction is this guy, Jan Marslek, is trying to use his nightclub owner contacts to try and broker a back channel to us to like deal with all these stories. And we soon realize he's the guy who is hiring private detectives to follow people around. And we assume he's the one who is hiring hackers who are constantly trying to break into all our devices. And he's the one who makes this absurd offer of a bribe, but he's clever enough to just have his friends do it. He never actually makes it himself. And so you start to realize, okay, this guy is weird and obviously criminal. And then he starts flashing around top secret documents as if he's trying to impress people. And so he's just sort of, we hear about this and he's sort of seeming, again, trying to make friends. And he seems to have these top secret documents with sort of the Russian objections to them, covering this sort of incident in the UK where a former KGB spy was poisoned with this nerve gas, Novichok. And it's got the recipe for it in them, and he's just sort of waving them around, going, hey, look what I've got. There's more where that came from if you want it. And that's the point where you're like, hang on a second. Who on earth is this guy? And, it ultimately turns out that, well, he's probably a Russian spy. And he's currently in Moscow. Although he does like to go to Dubai, like lots of the Russians do.
So when you say currently, so when we talk today, I was just trying to do some Googling. Is that he's living in some Russian castle? Like, is that kind of the story on where he is today?
So what happens is Wirecard collapses. It's this moment we have been waiting for months. We sort of they reach the end of the road. They either have to publish accounts, or God knows what happens, and they can't do it. And so what they do is they announce that, we've discovered a small problem. $2 billion is missing. We're sure we had it, but it seems to have gone walkabout. Not really sure what's happened here.
Well, it's a fraud, right? Like, and someone stole it from them, right?
Literally, they're like, someone's stolen all our money. And you're like, really, guys? Really? And so we're watching this, and it's like, we've finally done it. We have exposed these bastards. We've got them. And you kind of assume at that point that everyone's going to get arrested. But the German police are a bit slow on the uptake. And so, it takes them a few days to go, do you think there's some crimes have been committed here? And so in this period, our guy, Jan Marslek, who has sort of masterminded all of these schemes, he says he's flying to the Philippines to look for the money, to sort everything out. Let me tell you this, and if it goes again, I will... So he tells everyone he's going to the Philippines to find the money. And there's this whole period where, like, passenger records show that he arrived in the Philippines and flew to China. And then it turns out this is a completely false trail. He never got on the plane. And what he actually did is he took a flight from a Vienna airfield to Belarus, where he escaped into Russia. And he then goes on to this incredible second life because, you know, he's this sort of restless whiz kid businessman. He can't just sit around, you know, chatting with Steven Seagal and those kind of guys in Russia. So what he does is he makes himself useful. He knows some guys. And so a trial just finished this year in the UK of 6 Bulgarians accused of spying for Russia.
Wow.
And they were doing things like scoping out NATO bases, plotting schemes potentially to kidnap journalists, various people. I mean, you're into the realm of you're not quite sure how much of this is real, how much of this is in their heads. You know, because of the trial, we've got all these, you know, text messages back and forth between them all where they give themselves ridiculous spy nicknames. But the guy who was masterminding this gang of people spying for Russia in the UK was none other than Jan Marsalek, the former fintech chief operating officer. And so, yeah, it's every time that you think this story is done, this another like box springs open and a whole bunch of new madness comes flying out.
See, one thing I didn't understand, Dan, why did Marcus Braun stick around? Like if he had a sense of where this might end, wouldn't he never thought about, you know, jumping to Russia or something like that? Maybe he doesn't have the same contacts, I guess, as that Jan has. But why do you think Marcus Braun stuck around?
Well, he says he's innocent.
Yeah.
The money was stolen. He had no idea. This guy, tech billionaire, he used to strut around like he was Steve Jobs in like a black turtleneck.
Yeah.
You know, so he betrayed himself as, you know, the billionaire founder of this company, its biggest shareholder. And he claims to have no idea that his protege, Jan Marsalek, was running around stealing all the company's money. Now, the money never existed. The whole scheme doesn't make any sense. I'm pretty sure these are all lies. But I think we've speculated about this endlessly, but I think that was kind of maybe the deal. Because Marcus has a wife and a daughter. And you know, like I said, he never liked to travel.
Yeah.
When he was running the company, and it's kind of like, and also what do you just think about what it takes to be on the run for 30 years?
Yeah.
You know, constantly looking over his shoulder. Also, do you want to go to Moscow?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think he stayed behind and Marsalek escaped, and everyone was then very conveniently able to blame the guy who wasn't there anymore.
So Dan, we've talked now about going after Wirecard, uncovering some of the details which ultimately led to their collapse. What we haven't really covered is the measures that some of the folks at Wirecard kind of went after you, whether it's hacking your phone, hacking your computer. There's a crazy story in your book about you've got somebody out in the park who's got like a laser microphone aimed at your boardroom. That's just I can't even fathom that. And then we haven't even mentioned the Russian poison recipes as well, which I could imagine would start freaking anybody out. But give us some perspective on just kind of the dangers that you and your family faced while you were going through and uncovering this, slowly peeling back this multi-layered, onion.
So I'm always very conscious when I talk about this that, there are journalists out there properly putting their lives on the line. There's been hundreds of journalists killed in the last year or two in Gaza alone. There are people in the Philippines, Russia, who are in genuine peril. And one of the strange things through this was that there was never an explicit threat. It was always, the first thing I'd been told about this company was there were gangsters involved. So there was always this kind of subtext, this thing at the back of your mind of who are we really dealing with here? And that feeling never went away, and it got weirder and kind of scarier as things went on. And it was this sort of, when you compress what was essentially a 6-year investigation into like a brief summary, it kind of necessarily sounds insane, but it wasn't quite like that. It was this sort of steady but slow ratcheting up. So I start looking into this company, and it's weird. It doesn't behave like a normal company. And as soon as I start trying to speak to them, they say to me, are you in league with short sellers? Because we've had a lot of that. And this is the thing that they always use. Whenever anybody raises questions about them, they say they're trying to manipulate the share price. And hackers start trying to break into my emails, people who have also said or written nasty things about this company. Private detectives start following people around. We get offered this bribe. We start to realize that one of the main characters is hanging out with spies. And then what happens is we reach this breakthrough and we start publishing really big stories. We have proof that there is fraud going on inside the company. So, the first we get a whistleblower who basically tells us, not the whole story, but this very important part of it. He hands over this huge trove of documents. And we can show that $30 million worth of contracts are fake. And what's really weird is there was an internal investigation into the guys who did it. But it was the lawyer, our whistleblower, who gets pushed out, not the people who are guilty. And that's kind of like the big question. Wait, why didn't you fire all these guys? And so when we start to write these stories, that's when everything goes completely insane. Because, we published the first story. And within quite a short space of time, about $8 billion is knocked off the value of the company. We had the F word right there in the headline, fraud. And you're watching that thinking, I really hope this one's right.
Yeah.
And what happens is the reaction in Germany. So Wirecard uses the same playbook again. It says, I'm corrupt. Me and my colleagues have leaked our story to stock market speculators. And all we're trying to do, the Financial Times has given its pages over to this rogue journalist who, for some reason, is targeting this great German company. And what's kind of wild is the German authorities believe it. So the German government launches this criminal investigation into me and my colleague, Stefania Palmer, who wrote the big story with me. And then they suspend short selling in Wirecard stock. They say to protect the German economy. And I'm watching this thinking the world has gone mad. This is completely crazy. I'm the one who's under criminal investigation. And then this is the point where we start to really discover that one of the main guys might be a Russian spy. He's suddenly hanging out with a bunch of spies. And this sort of sting operation happens where it seems like they've got a whole bunch of evidence. And as this is sort of going on, and it turns into this battle. I mean, we genuinely felt like we were in a street fight. We had to kill them. We had to prove that they were the bad guys, whereas they were trying to kill us and prove that we were corrupt. And there were moments in that where I started to feel very vulnerable. Because, I don't know, I always assume as a journalist you get a kind of protection. Because the police are really going to care about, if a journalist, if my legs get broken, They're going to care about that in a way that they absolutely do not about esoteric financial crimes. So you kind of feel like you get a bit of protection like that as a journalist. But with all this smoke flying around, you know, all these accusations of corruption, at that point I kind of felt if something happened to me, well, maybe people would just shrug and say, well, he was mixed up with the wrong crowd. Maybe he got what he was coming to him. And, you know, that I would lie there awake at night, sort of going through my head, you know, what happens in the case of like a home invasion? I mean, there were periods where I sort of would just keep a hammer under the bed. I don't know for what purpose, but that was kind of my state of mind. I was deeply paranoid. I would be checking the bushes outside my house for, you know, cameras or listening equipment. You know, trying not to let the neighbours see me doing that. I don't want them thinking that I'm some crazy paranoiac. And then we start to realise that there's this team of about 30 private detectives running around London trying to catch us talking to our sources. And the guy running it is a former head of Libyan intelligence. And at that point, you're kind of thinking, what? I mean, for one thing, I started to think maybe they were going to get away with it. Are they protected? What is it that we don't know? And you also start to think, okay, we're in way over our heads here. And there was so one of, you know, if you're buying 30 private detectives at a time, the quality is hard to come by. So one of them flips, this corrupt former police officer, and he tells us about a strategy which they had considered but decided they weren't going to use it yet, which is this old gangland trick where they would plant drugs in my car, then call the police. And you're kind of like, should I be relieved that they haven't felt this is necessary? But that's the kind of thing that would just blow up your entire life.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine all the police coming to the door?
Absolutely.
Funny story, officer. There's this German company that is out to get me. I mean, and I think that was in some ways more terrifying than any sort of physical threat.
And why do you think they didn't do that? Like do you think there was a reason why they didn't actually go through that final that step of really trying to go after you, taking that extra step of doing something like that?
I think their tactics seem to be working. They had maybe thought that they'd successfully discredited us. And then what happens is we basically, you know, I write, sort of October 29, I write the story. This is how they're committing the fraud. These are the fake customers. This is how they're doing it. And if you don't believe us, here are all the documents. See for yourself. And I think from that point onwards, it didn't matter. It had become inevitable at that point. It was it had gone beyond the point where they could just throw it back at us.
That is that's terrifying. You know, because you know, you think about, like I said, would they go after you? Well, there's certainly been stories about prominent people who have been poisoned. You know what I mean? And there's a mystery as to what happened to them. Like, it's not like it's this or that. You know what I mean? It's that is really, really terrifying.
I've got to say as well, I mean, there's, you know, the Russian aspect was possibly the scariest because, you know, there are a lot of people who've fallen out of windows in London.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think for a long time, during and afterwards, I didn't really believe it because it seems so fantastical. You know, during the whole thing, we talked about, should we publish some of this? And part of it was like, it was impossible to write because people were too scared before Wirecard collapsed. But also, we were just like, no one will believe us.
Yeah.
It's so completely crazy. This guy's a Russian spy. He's trying to set up a Libyan militia group. What on earth are you talking about? That's madness.
And before you got into the details, did guys like Paul and stuff who have been around the block say, look, Dan, like, just so you know, this is where this can go, is that, you could, hackers and all this sort of stuff, or was this really an unusual event for, a Financial Times investigative reporter?
This was so far beyond anything we had ever experienced before. Like you kind of forget because hacking has become so much more prominent.
Yep.
Like the use of encrypted messaging has become so much more prominent over the last decade. But when we started this, 2014, 2015, none of that was like taken for granted or commonplace. It was quite unusual to be thinking about source protection in those terms and things. So we kind of learnt about it, a little bit the hard way, but so much of what we were discovering then has now become just sort of commonplace in the practice of journalism. So it was kind of a weird thing, but certainly, we had never had anything like this before.
Now, what is there anything left of Wirecard today, Dan? When you look at it, is it basically the company is wiped off the face of the planet, and then there's a couple, is there any other executives other than the CEO who's kind of facing some lengthy jail sentences?
So it had a North American prepaid card business, which is still around. That got bought by someone. Prepaid cards is just a world, man. Like you could just load thousands of dollars onto this card and just hand it over to someone. It's kind of useful for certain activities. Yeah. There are little bits of the business still around because it was one of the things, like if you're committing a large-scale ongoing financial fraud, you have to try and look as much like a normal business as possible, right? And so Wirecard had a real payment processing business. It was just much smaller than people thought, and it lost money. And if you don't have to make money, you can win business, right?
Yep.
And what they then had was this kind of magic business, right? They had the bit that everyone knew about, and because they had sort of grown by buying lots of businesses, everything was very siloed. So there were very few people who had sort of an overview of the whole business. And there was, at the point when it all came to a head, there were people inside who were starting to go, hang on a second, how are you guys making all that money over there? And what they told people kind of, do you remember I talked about, what some investors told themselves? Mm-hmm. That was kind of the lie that worked internally as well. You give people a plausible explanation. So they said, well, those payments which are too hot to handle for us, what we do is we send them out to our friends.
Yeah.
They do all the processing, deal with all the risk, and they just send us back a really big commission. And it's great. And that is sort of was enough explanation. And it was also enough for people to go, I don't really want to know anything about that. I'm not going to make it my business to find out. And so the cover story kind of worked inside as well. And there's interesting things. If you're a sort of a connoisseur of accounting fraud, one of the great challenge in any fraud is how do you hide the fact that there should be cash in this business and there isn't? And what Wirecard did was they solved it by coming up with this sort of fake bank account thing. And once you've done that, every year you just add another zero.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing with cash as well is it's not like a factory that you can go and validate. There's a level of trust that is supposed to exist within the financial institutions that that cash is there. It's again, that whole story you have in your book, Dan, about how going and knocking on doors with KPMG and trying to find this cash. Again, it's pretty very, very interesting for anybody to read that whole part of the book, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, maybe of where the $2 billion is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
And I think we should say KPMG were the guys who were bought in at the end. It was Ernst & Young who audited
Who were the
this
auditors?
for a decade.
100%. And you talk about prominence again, like we talked earlier about the prominence of Wirecard. They were audited by one of the big four. One of the large accounting firms, one of the largest accounting firms in the world, being Ernst & Young. And to be fair to the accounting firms, I think all of them have had issues with potential or issues where companies have gone bust that they were involved with. But it just so happened that in the case of Wirecard, it was EY who was the auditors. And again, your book goes into some very delving into the relationship between Wirecard and the auditors. Again, if you're kind of an accounting nerd like I am, that sort of stuff is really interesting. And maybe Dan, if as we wrap up here, is maybe taking a step back from Wirecard and looking at things more holistically. Is Wirecard a one-off, or like you still say, is that, whatever it's been, 5 to 10 years later, there's still lots of frauds out there. It's just a matter of trying to find them.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely enough to keep me busy for the time being.
Yeah.
But, money was free for a decade, and that hides an awful lot of sins. And you have some kind of crazy stock market valuations out there.
Yeah.
You have some figures in the stock market who seem to be able to get away with anything. And I think it's, every cycle you discover something new, some new way that everyone has been deceived. And I think there's sort of, there are various people who talk about this as sort of the natural level of the bezel. There is always a certain level of skullduggery or, crime around the edges. And it's kind of what proportion do you accept as a society? And that's what gives these fraudsters the cover. Because we live in this sort of trust-based economy where it's very inefficient to go around checking everything, because most of the time you will find that the things are there.
Yeah.
And you'll have all just wasted time and effort to check things which don't need to be checked. And because of that, people never check. And so they rely on things like social proof. And so, this company is big and valuable, so I assume someone's checked, right?
Yeah.
And, every so often we discover something new and exciting. I mean, I will admit this cycle has brought some, innovations I would not have predicted, like rolling a truck down a hill, to like Nikola, to garner an incredible stock market valuation. But who knows what we'll find out next. And if anyone has any tips, by the way, please do get in touch.
And is there one red flag that sticks out to you, Dan? Like you talked about, complexity of the business. No businesses are that complicated to get anyone's head wrapped around if you spend enough time. Is there one red flag that jumps out to say, look, based on your experience, if you see this, there's smoke and maybe there's fire, just based on, and maybe that's interactions as well with the executives. You talk about lying and catching. Is there one thing that jumps out and saying, look, if you've got this red flag, there's probably some.
Let me give you one red flag and one behavioral thing. So the red flag in the Wirecard case, which in retrospect now seems really obvious, is you had this fast-growing company that was massively cash flow positive every single year, but its debt kept on going up. And when you look back at it now, you're like, oh yeah, that's weird, isn't it? Maybe someone should have noticed that. So I think that is, one of the big red flags just to keep an eye out for. And the other one is behavioral. There's Mark Cahodas is a more controversial figure these days, but also one of the OG short sellers. And he always has this great phrase, there's never just one cockroach in the kitchen. Yeah. So if you find a company lying about anything, doesn't have to be massive, but if they are lying about something, they are going to be lying about other things as well.
That's a good way to finish, I think, Dan. I think that's probably not just good advice for investigating companies. It's probably good advice for, dealing with people in general. It's probably not, they've lied. It's probably not the first time that
Yeah.
they've lied. So, well, Dan, thank you very much. This was a fun conversation. Again, thank you for joining. Thank you for all the good work you do, obviously, at Financial Times. I hope people have gotten a much better perspective of the role of a investigative journalist, and again, specifically the work Dan has done, and frankly the risk that he took with Wirecard and probably still takes on a regular basis. But Dan, for this chat again, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, Scott. And also, one final plug I've just remembered. Please, the book is, I hope people will enjoy it, but there is also, Netflix did a great job of a documentary, Scandal, Bringing Down Wirecard, which is quite a fun watch as well. Okay,
good. I will add that to my watch list. So yeah. No, it's a good, great, really good recommendation. And again, read the book. I would highly, as I mentioned to you earlier, Dan, I've been speaking at a couple internal conferences. I've been running some trivia, and my trivia giveaway has been your book.
Amazing!
We've been giving away a bunch of them to folks who get the trivia right. And again, I just think there's so many really good lessons to be learned. Learning about what happened with Wirecard, because frankly, like you said, the next one is probably not that far around the corner. If there's one thing, history repeats itself, and I'm sure we're going to have another repeat at some point. So to the extent that you can read your book, Dan, and learn from it, which hopefully you learn, and try to find the next one for all of us out there, we'd certainly be better off. Yeah, but thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Scott.
All right.